John went out for a run and he dropped dead suddenly without any warning. And for a long time afterwards, I wasn't able to talk about that moment when I had to tell them that their father had died.
Wow.
Yeah, I was prescribed an SSRI and I suffered a very severe adverse reaction. The reaction of the medics was to say, you need to go for psychiatric help. And I really began to despair because every time I went for help, I was more or less being told this is in your head.
It's actually heartbreaking to listen to.
Yeah. I developed a delusional conviction of guilt. What I began to believe was that my children had been harmed by my medication and that it was my fault.
So when you went into hospital then, what happened?
I would have been asked every single day, do you have thoughts of harm?
Do you think that the constant questioning about that had an effect on you as well?
Absolutely. So I actually ended up making a false confession to them and said, you're right, I have thoughts of harm. I've been hiding my medication. And I ended up making my situation much, much worse. TUSLA had become involved, the Child and Family Agency. I was told that they were about to conduct a child protection assessment. I wasn't allowed to see my children until TUSLA approved of it.
So that fear that is instilled in you as a mother, you know?
It was excruciating to be separated from them. I feel I was treated as less than human.
So Marianne, you're so welcome.
Thank you very much, Laura.
To the podcast.
Really nice to be here.
Yeah, I am on a lovely evening.
Yes.
How are you?
I'm great, thank you.
You're on the book publicity circuit. And how's it going for you?
It's actually been great. It's been really exciting and really interesting to get an insight into a whole world that I knew very little about before, really. PR, media.
Yeah, I know.
Publicity. It's not my world, and I've really enjoyed, just fascinated really to see how it all works.
Are you tired after it? Because it's been, when was your book? When did it first come out?
So it's almost exactly a month ago. Okay. I was just thinking that today. It was published on the 15th of May, so just over a month ago. To be honest, I quite enjoy speaking in public.
Okay.
So,
well, you are a lecturer.
I'm a lecturer and I'm quite used to, not that I actually lecture to big groups of students, but still over the years, I would have had to occasionally speak to a big group, and I don't really have a problem with speaking in public. So I've quite enjoyed it, I have to say. The only difficult aspect to it is, of course, that it's quite an emotional subject. So it's not so much the speaking in public as sometimes the content of what I'm talking about. That's not always the easiest to talk about.
I can imagine. Yeah. So can we talk about what happened and why you wrote the book?
Yes. Well, it all happened 10 years ago now. It's exactly 10 years since my husband died. So we had his 10th anniversary there in April. His name was John. He was 10 years older than me. He was from the UK originally. We had met, I suppose, what you would call a bit later in life, even though from my perspective now, I don't think I was that old when I met him, but I was in my mid-30s when I met him. And we had been together for 15 years. We had 2 small children together. And 10 years ago in April, John went out for a run and he dropped dead suddenly without any warning, completely unexpectedly, completely out of the blue. I had gone off to work and he had taken the children to school, and I learnt about it when I was in work that something had happened to him. I was told over the phone that something had happened to him, that I needed to come to the hospital in Dunleary and I needed to bring somebody with me. And it was a guard that I was talking to who told that to me when I rang John's phone that day from work. And I asked the guard to tell me over the phone what had happened, and he wouldn't tell me over the phone.
Did you phone John's phone or did they phone you?
So I phoned John's phone, and the reason I did that was I was at work and I came out of a long meeting and I noticed that I'd missed a good number of calls on my phone. I'd missed up to 6 calls. And I was, especially 10 years ago, I didn't get calls on my mobile phone. I just used it for text messaging. So I knew something unusual was up. And I tried to ring back those numbers, and just one of them was one of the schools that my children were attending, who told me that my son hadn't been picked up at lunchtime. And so then I rang John's phone to ask what was happening, or why hadn't he been picked up? And John's phone was answered by a guard.
Okay.
So that's what happened. And that guard, he wouldn't give me the information over the phone, and I knew what that meant. Okay. He said, something's happened to John. I said, what's happened to John? And he wouldn't tell me over the phone. And I turned to my colleague at work and I said, something's happened to John. I think he's dead. And he had died. He had literally collapsed and died near our home. So that was the first thing that happened 10 years ago.
Goodness me.
Yeah.
And then you got to the hospital and you were told?
Yeah. I was told in the hospital car park, and then I was asked to identify the body because he didn't have any form of identification on him. And I identified the body, and then I had to go home and I had to pick up my children who were being minded by a neighbour, and I had to tell them what had happened. For a long time afterwards, I wasn't able to talk about that moment when I had to tell them that their father had died. I just burst into tears every time I tried to talk about it. But I have got used to talking about it. I've written about it in my book. And what happened was I picked up my two children from the neighbour who was minding them, and I wanted to bring them back home to the house to tell them there what had happened.
How old were your children at the time?
8 and 6. And the 8-year-old, as we were walking back, he kept asking me, where's Dad? Where's Dad? Because he had been expecting his dad. He'd been expecting his dad to pick him up at school that day. And I kept saying to him, I'll tell you when we get back to the house. I'll tell you when we get back to the house. And then he asked me, is he dead? So my 8-year-old son asked me, is his father dead? And I said, he is dead. And we stood there, the three of us, kind of rooted to the spot in the middle of the road. And that was the moment when I felt I was shattering their lives forever, their happiness, by having to tell them that their father had died. So that was the start of the episode that I describe in my book. I mean, I describe it. It's a long story. But
you can talk about it as much or as little as you want.
So my book is called The Episode. Now, obviously, losing my husband was not an episode. That's something that will always be with you. You'll always carry that grief and that shock with you in some shape or form. That is not something that ever completely comes to an end. But what happened over the following months was, to begin with, I would say what I was experiencing was a severe form of what I would now call normal grief. I mean, I was absolutely devastated, as you would be, by the suddenness of the loss, by also seeing my children suffer. I found that very, very difficult. Their loss, trying to comfort them in their loss while grieving myself and barely able to function myself, I suppose.
Did you have family around you to help you?
Well, that's a good question, because I didn't have much family around. And the reason for that was only between myself and John, there was only one of our parents still alive. My mother was elderly. She was 90 years old at the time, a very fit 90-year-old, but still, she was 90, still living at home, and she was supportive. But John was an only child, and both his parents had passed away, so there wasn't family on his side. And on my side, all of my siblings emigrated a long time ago. I'm the fifth of 6 children, so there wasn't really immediate family around except for my mother. I had friends, who did what they could, but I think in retrospect, what I lacked was that kind of constant support of somebody who might have been able to maybe move into my house with me, or me to move in, me and my children to move in. I've heard of other people doing that in that kind of situation. So after a few months, I began to wonder, and other people began to ask me if I thought that I might be suffering from depression. again, in retrospect, I would say grief and depression probably look quite similar.
Where does one end?
Yeah,
and one begin?
yeah, exactly. And sometimes we maybe want easy answers or black and white answers to questions like that. Is it grief? Is it depression? Where in fact, it's not really that different.
Grief isn't tangible.
Yeah.
And grief has so many symptoms with it, and it can affect so many bodily functions, the way your mind works, everything.
And like in retrospect, I think what I was experiencing, and we're talking just 2 to 3 months after the bereavement, it's still what I would probably call normal grief, especially having subsequently experienced something much more severe. What I was experiencing at that time was very, very difficult, but it's natural, I think, if you lose your life partner and you lose them very suddenly, or even if you lose them after protracted illness, that you will feel devastated. But the question started to be asked of me, might this be depression, and might it help you to take an antidepressant, you know? And then I started to worry about that as well. You know, am I depressed? And what does that mean?
Were you back to work yet? Who was asking you this? Who was saying to you, you might be depressed? Was it friends or colleagues?
It was mainly my siblings, kind of over the phone.
Okay.
Yeah. And maybe 1 or 2 friends as well. I wasn't back at work. And again, I think in some ways I was lucky that my academic year was over at that time. You know, the summer months were coming. I didn't need to go back to work. But on the other hand, maybe it would have been good for me if I'd had to go back to work after a certain amount of time. But the fact is, I had my summer holidays and I didn't need to go back to work. So I wasn't working. Before I go on to the next part of the story, the other aspect of what I was experiencing at that time was I was really very focused and worried about the children and about what it was going to mean for them, having lost their father, what it meant for them now, what it was going to mean for them moving forwards. And that's where my focus was the whole time. I was very kind of worried and panicked about my ability to look after them, to I suppose be the sole person responsible for them.
I can totally relate to that. I have 3 boys.
Yeah.
I can totally relate to what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because their lives have changed completely.
Yes, exactly. And it seemed like such an enormous task that I was facing, to parent them alone from then to adulthood, which was going to be 10 years, 12 years, more years. Like now I know that I have been able to do that on my own. But at the time when I was suffering myself from such devastation, it seemed like something that I couldn't possibly achieve on my own, you know?
Yeah.
When people started to ask me about, am I depressed? Should I take an antidepressant? I was very reluctant to try psychiatric medication, but I decided after considering that and listening to people making that suggestion to me, I decided, well, maybe I will try it. I mean, maybe it can help. I'd never taken psychiatric medication before. And my doctor as well was a bit reluctant to put me on medication. You know, sometimes we hear about doctors being trigger happy with medication. It wasn't the case at all with my GP. My GP was saying, well, look, this is grief. This is what happens. You know, if you lose somebody who's very dear to you, you need to go through the pain of grief to process it, to come out the other side. But if you really want me to prescribe medication to you, we can try that as well. But she was quite reluctant. But I eventually said, yes, I would like to try it. And I was prescribed an SSRI. And I suffered a very severe adverse reaction to this SSRI that I took. I only ever took 3 doses of the drug.
Just for anyone listening, SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it's used for anxiety and depression in general.
And within a few hours of taking the first dose of that drug, I woke in the night with a burning sensation throughout my body. Burning, prickling, tingling throughout my limbs and my torso and my forehead. I was sweating. I was overcome with nausea. I was terrified, absolutely terrified of these symptoms. And I took the next 2 doses of the drug then the second day, and my doctor had said, you might feel worse before you feel better on these drugs. So I hoped that it was that. But the prickling and the burning continued.
So you had continuous prickling and burning?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Very severe.
Okay.
And I went back to my doctor in a panic, and the doctor said, fine, we'll discontinue the drug. But the prickling and the burning continued and continued on. And in the end, I had that sensation throughout my body for a number of weeks.
Wow.
Yeah. And look, I have read up, I've tried to get to the root of what that was about. Was it psychosomatic? You know, was it due to the anxiety? Was it because I didn't really trust these drugs in the first place? Or was it actually a physical? Which is what it felt like. More than anything, it felt this is a physical reaction to a specific drug. And in very rare cases, I have read as well about bizarre bodily sensations, up to and including burning. In few people, I don't want to say this is a common reaction, but just a possible side effect. But regardless of what it was an intensely distressing sensation that made it very difficult for me to do anything else, to focus, to eat, to sleep. And I began, I went to a number of different doctors at that time. So we're talking over a few weeks period, still about 3 to 4 months after the bereavement. And each time I went for medical help, the reaction of the medics was to say, this is a psychiatric problem. This is not anything physical that we are familiar with. It doesn't match any diagnostic category.
Was it GPs you were going to?
So I went, first of all, back to my own GP, which is really a medical centre with a number of different doctors. I wasn't always necessarily seeing the same doctor.
Okay.
And when I went back, I was put on a different psychiatric drug. So I was put on an SNRI, which is like an SSRI, but it's for anxiety. Yeah. And told, well, the symptoms should subside, but they didn't. I remember I went to A&E at that time because I was so distressed, and I got one of my friends to bring me to an A&E department. And again, they said to me, this is a psychiatric problem. You need to go for psychiatric help. And I had a home visit as well from a doctor. So I was in severe distress over this physical symptom or symptoms. And I began in that context to despair and to experience hopelessness about what I was experiencing at a time when my resources were already so depleted. I mean, this was a few months after the bereavement when, you know, I'd spent all those months grieving and trying to comfort the children. And now I had this physical sensation, which was unbearable for me. And I really began to despair and to believe I was never going to get better, because every time I went for help, I was told, I was more or less, not in so many words, but I was more or less being told, this is in your head. That was the message that I was hearing.
Okay.
And I was saying back, but no, it's in my body. I can feel it, and please help me with it. So in that context, I was referred to psychiatric services.
Okay.
So my GP, I had gone back to my GP again, and my GP had asked me a question, had said something like, you know, do you have thoughts of suicide? Do you have thoughts of ending your life? And I had said something like, no, but it's hard for me to see a future for myself with this burning and prickling throughout my body. And that was the trigger, me saying that. I was then referred to psychiatric services.
Okay.
Okay. So to the local mental health service, you could say, for a crisis assessment.
Okay.
Yeah. So that was the start of my psychiatric journey.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
That is interesting, isn't it?
It is. And for me, it's very clear that my psychiatric journey started with the burning in my body in a context when I was bereaved and suffering from grief, but there was that mediating factor, if you understand.
Yeah.
So what I experienced then afterwards, and I can talk about the psychosis and everything, I don't think you could say there was a direct line from the grief to the psychosis. It was mediated by this experience of extreme bodily discomfort as a result of starting the SSRI.
Okay.
I don't have the answers to all the questions as to why that happened, but it did happen to me. And it was that burning in my body that made me, for the first time, experience despair and hopelessness.
Okay. So tell me what that looked like then for you.
So I was assessed by this mental health service. I remember that assessment interview, and I describe it in the book as well, when I was insisting that there's something wrong with me physically and that I need to have a medical examination. And I was almost pleading for a medical examination. And the person assessing me obviously was interested in assessing my mental health, asking me, did I have thoughts of harm? How was my sleep? How was my appetite? And I think we were kind of at cross purposes with one another. But anyway, as a result of that assessment, I was asked to start attending a day hospital run by the mental health service. So I did start attending that then a couple of days later. So now we're at the end of August 2015. John had died the end of April. So we're talking, I guess it's 5 months after the bereavement. I attended a day hospital. So what that meant was I was going in and out every day for group therapy sessions. So it could be anything from yoga to art therapy to music therapy. I mean, a very rich program, and also group sessions where people might discuss strategies for coping in a very general way in a group. And to begin with, I attended that day hospital for 1 week. And during that week, my symptoms worsened. So I was still suffering terribly from these physical sensations the whole time throughout my body.
Were you still on the SNRI at this stage?
Yes, I was on the SNRI. And when I was referred to psychiatric services, they then added in benzodiazepine and a sleeping tablet as well. Okay. So I was kind of now taking three different drugs. But during that week, when I was attending the day centre, I developed what I subsequently realised was a delusional conviction of guilt. Okay. So I began to believe something that wasn't true. And what it was, what I began to believe was that my children had been harmed by my medication and that it was my fault. So this belief, it came out of the blue. I remember I described it in the book, the particular evening when it took hold of me very suddenly. A delusion of guilt. It's possible for me now to interpret where that delusion of guilt came from. So all of the elements of that delusion, I think, were in my life before they all came jumbled up into this one thought that I became fixated on. So there was my distress over my children's loss and my extreme worry for them and concern about how life was going to be for them without their father. So that my really strong feeling that they had been harmed, but harmed by the loss of their father. My concern about psychiatric medication and complete panic over what was happening to me physically. And also that feeling that I'd had since the day John died, that in some way, you know, when I had to tell my children that their father had died, that I was inflicting a terrible harm on them, and that it was in some way my fault, that I hadn't protected them. And I had that feeling over the weeks and months after John died, that in some way not in a rational way, but it's not entirely irrational either, that they had been let down by life. And I, as their parent, as their mother, hadn't protected them from losing their father. I mean, that's not a totally rational way of thinking. But at the same time, I think people could understand that.
Oh, 100%.
So all of these very strong concerns that I'd had for a number of months all became jumbled up in my head in the context when I was experiencing this excruciating burning that was distracting me from everything else, and where I felt I couldn't get help for it. And I became convinced that the children had been harmed, and that they'd been harmed by my medication, and that it was my fault. And then I kept searching in my mind for...
As in that they took your medication?
Yeah, yes. Okay. Well, so that they had swallowed my medication. Now, because I believed it was my fault, I kept trying to remember. So it was something that I believed had happened over the previous week, 2 weeks, since I had started taking the medication myself. And I thought either I left the medication lying around and they found it, almost as if they were babies. Like, probably an 8 or a 6-year-old wouldn't do that anyway, even if they found a pill. They're probably unlikely to in fact swallow it. But still, I thought maybe something like that had happened. Or I worried that maybe, because my mind was so confused at that point, that maybe I had dropped the medication into food while I was cooking. Could that have happened? Or had I, worst possible case scenario, had I actually put it in intentionally? So I had all these thoughts and doubts and worries swirling around in my mind. And as I was going into the day hospital every day, I started to tell them in there what I believed had happened.
Okay.
Yeah. So I chose there was one particular professional, I'll just say, one of the professionals in there who was particularly kind and approachable. And I chose her to disclose it to. So I was very careful who I was going to tell my worst secret to, this terrible burden of guilt, because now I believe that I had destroyed my children's lives, that this medication that they had taken had destroyed their brains, that they were never going to be happy again, they were never going to be successful again, they were never going to make friends. And I started unburdening myself to this one professional. And as a result of me saying that, and I said it over a number of days, it was suggested to me that I needed to go to hospital. So I did go into a psychiatric hospital.
Okay.
In Dublin. Yeah.
And did the professional know that you hadn't done it?
She did. Yeah, no, they knew that, because I've looked at all my files now as well.
Okay.
They did know that, but they were very worried.
Yeah.
Because obviously they were very worried. I mean, I'm delusional. I'm delusional about my children. I'm delusional about my medication. I'm living on my own. I'm minding 2 small children on my own. And they were very worried, naturally enough.
Okay.
Not so much that this had really happened. They kept saying to me, they don't think this has happened. They said, we think this is a symptom of your illness. But I was 100% convinced that it had happened, even though I had no recollection of it. I'd say they would have been very worried about my state of mind deteriorating further.
Okay.
Yeah, because they've seen lots of different cases. But the fact of the matter was, it was always a delusion of guilt relating to the past tense. I always thought, like, something has happened. It's happened in the last few weeks. And it's a very cruel belief, actually, when you think about it, because there's no way of proving or disproving something like that relating to the past tense. And also, you know, that I blame myself for it. But they would have been worried, all right, and I can see it in my files, and I do understand they would have been worried this might flip into something else. Mm-hmm. So no matter what they said to me, I was absolutely convinced that this had happened. So that's what a delusional conviction is like. Wow. It takes hold of you, no matter what anybody tries to say to you, look, you can see that they're doing fine. You have a reason in your head why you say to yourself, I would have said to myself, that's only just because they can't really see it. other people can't see what's wrong with my children. I can see it. I'm their mother. And also this delusional belief was something's happened inside them. It's happened inside their brains, so nobody can see it on the outside. So it was a very cruel belief, because there was no way, cruel to myself, there was no way of me being able to prove this or disprove it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you went into hospital then, what happened? Who was looking after your children actually during this time?
So this is a really important question, and it became more important as time went on, and more of a worry for me. So when I went into hospital first, somebody mentioned 2 weeks to me. So it was kind of 2 weeks was the time. I don't know if it was a nurse or a doctor or perhaps my mother. Or it was going to be for 2 weeks. And I had very close friends who lived nearby who said immediately that they'd take the children for 2 weeks. And that was a great weight off my mind. And I also had, at that point, I was employing a kind of a nanny, a live-out nanny who supported them. So I knew that it wasn't even, the whole burden of it wasn't going to fall to my friends, that this nanny would be helping them. So I just made it my job to get out of that hospital in 2 weeks. And that's what happened. What I mean by that is when I was in hospital, I was given medication. By that stage, I was also on an antipsychotic, as well as an antidepressant and a sleeping tablet and a benzo. I would have been sleeping quite well while I was in the hospital, just because of, I would say a large part of it being because of the medication as well. I mean, antipsychotics, I think, do help you to sleep as well. I was eating because they made sure that I was eating, because I hadn't been eating before that. I'd lost 2.5 stone by the time I was hospitalised, because I couldn't eat with the burning and then with the obsession that something had happened to the children. And apart from medication, I wasn't ever offered any kind of talk therapy when I was in hospital. So there's nobody sitting down with me in a one-to-one therapeutic relationship and gently trying to tease out what was going on with me. I was invited into team meetings in the hospital where there would be like a number of professionals, could be 4, 5 doctors, nurses, social workers. And I would be asked in those team meetings, and I was also asked by the nurses on the ward a number of times a day, I'd be asked, did I have thoughts of harm? Did I think something had happened to my children? And it was very hard for me to answer those questions in front of that many people.
Yeah, is it unusual that you would be questioned like that in front of a number of professionals?
Well, that's what happened the whole time throughout my hospital stay, because altogether in the second half of 2015, I spent 12 weeks in hospital. So there was the original 2-week period when I was discharged home after 2 weeks, even though I still had the delusion of guilt. And then there was a later period of 10 weeks. So altogether, I spent 12 weeks. And during that entire time, I never had any talk therapy. So I never had anybody sitting down like you are now with me, one-to-one, on a regular basis, offering me any type of therapeutic intervention. What I did have once or twice a week, less often as time went on, you would go into a team meeting with your consultant, with maybe 1 or 2 other doctors, social workers, nurses, sometimes outside professionals visiting medics. And you were expected at those meetings to open up about your most intimate, most guilty secret. I can't say whether that's normal. All I can say is that's what happened to me. And I found those team meetings absolutely terrifying and intimidating and, just completely counter-therapeutic.
And did you answer truthfully in the meetings then, or did you try and keep...
Well, so I remember initially I was asked, about my children and did I feel something had happened to my children, and I would have just mumbled something about that maybe they've changed a bit, but I just couldn't answer truthfully, I suppose, because I was so consumed with guilt as well. I just simply couldn't answer to a panel of professionals who were asking me in that way. And I remember it was actually, I don't know, whether this is relevant, but it was actually they who used the word poison for the first time. And I just remember thinking, that's not what I meant. I didn't mean that I'd poisoned them. I meant that something has happened to their brains, but there was no word for that, so it was just, no, I couldn't open up at all. But what did happen during that 2-week period was the burning in my body went away.
Okay.
It did go away, but now I was consumed with guilt and with this conviction that I'd harmed my children. So I was in no better of a situation mentally than while my body was burning, because that obsession had just given away to this new conviction.
Okay.
So to begin with, as I said, I was in hospital for 2 weeks. I was discharged home. I would have been physically doing better. I had been eating well for 2 weeks. I'd been sleeping well, but I still had my delusion of guilt. So I still had this belief that something had happened to my children. And I was asked to attend the day hospital again. So I did. I went back to attending the day hospital for 4 weeks. And during that period, to begin with, I was doing okay, but gradually I just started to decline again. And I started to open up again to the same professional. And I started to tell her again, I still think my children have been harmed by my medication. I'm really worried. I don't know what to do. They started to say to me, you need to come back into hospital. And at that point, I didn't really have anybody to look after my children. Like, it was too much to expect the same friends, or it seemed to be too much. I didn't feel I could ask them again. I felt I just didn't have anybody really to mind my children. So the medics were saying, you need to come back into hospital. And I was saying, I can't come back into hospital. I've got nobody to mind my children. But in the end, after 4 weeks, I did have to go back in. I was always a voluntary patient, even though it didn't feel voluntary, but I was voluntary. But that difference between voluntary and involuntary isn't always very clear.
I know.
Yeah.
So what happened then when you did go into hospital? Where did your children go?
They stayed at home, and my mother moved into the house as a constant presence, but my mother was 90, so there was no way my mother was going to be looking after 2 young boys on her own. And after a week during which my friends came and stayed the night, or took them to their different sets of friends, helped out, a roster of childminders was put in place on a kind of rolling 24-hour basis, and I paid for that, indirectly. Then my mother then would have settled up with them, and sort of, I kind of wrote the checks, if you like, while I was in hospital. So that was put in place after a week when I had been rehospitalised, yeah.
But even that's such a burden.
Yeah.
On you at the time when you're already burdened.
Yeah. So when I was rehospitalised, we're in early October. Okay, so I had spent 2 weeks in September in hospital. Then I'd been at home for 4 weeks, and then I was back in hospital. And I was at an even lower ebb, I would say, than the first time around. I hadn't been eating. I hadn't been drinking water. I hadn't been sleeping. All of my energy had been focused on the children, and the children were okay. I was managing to feed them, to make sure that they slept, but it was all depleted and reduced into that. And I had been completely neglecting myself. During the time my initial hospitalisation and the 4 weeks at home, and then I'm back in hospital. And all of that time, I would have been asked every single day when I was in the day hospital, do you have thoughts of harm? Every time I would go and seek somebody out and say, I think something's happened to my children, I would make this confession. And then the next thing, do you have thoughts of harm? Now, when I was asked, do you have thoughts of harm, it meant future focus thoughts of harm. Because I knew that, because then they'd say, well, do you plan to harm yourself? Do you intend to harm anybody else? I was also asked intensively whether I'd been taking my medication because, well, it's kind of clear to me from my notes as well that there was a suspicion that I wasn't taking my medication because it wasn't working. That's the thing. By the time I was re-hospitalised, I'd been on psychiatric medication for 2 months. I'd been on an antipsychotic for 2 months, and still I was delusional. Now, these drugs, I mean, I have read up quite a bit in order to write my book. And as you well know, they don't always work.
No.
The same drugs don't necessarily work for the same people. And certainly the antipsychotic drug I had been on for two months just wasn't working. Clearly, because I was still psychotic. And as for the antidepressant, I mean, the psychosis, the delusional belief was, I would say, responsible for making me severely depressed. I was severely depressed. And I would say the causation is that way around. I mean, if you believe you've destroyed your children's lives, then that in itself is going to make you so depressed. But like, I was taking antidepressant drugs as well. So this question, are you taking your medication? Are you taking your medication? I knew that they suspected me of not taking my medication, but I was taking my medication because I wanted to get better. And even though I was suspicious of the medication, even though I had this delusional belief around medication, I still took my medication because I, as I say, I do have a healthy respect for professionals, and I wanted to get better.
And I ask you when they kept asking you about, do you have the intention of harming? Yeah. Do you think that the constant questioning about that had an effect on you as well?
Absolutely. So it reinforced my belief in my own guilt. And what actually happened was, after I was re-hospitalised, I said, and I was at an even lower ebb, and this questioning kept continuing and continuing. I describe it in the book. It's kind of the midpoint of the book. It's the lowest point of the whole episode. I actually ended up making a false confession to them. I actually ended up saying, yeah, I do. Okay. I just kind of threw in the towel and said, you're right. I have thoughts of harm. I intend this. I intend that. I've been hiding my medication. All your worst thoughts about me actually are true. So I ended up, and it's in a chapter called False Confession, because it absolutely was a false confession. Yeah. Even while I was saying it, I knew it wasn't true. But it was to stop the incessant questioning. And I ended up making my situation much, much worse. Yeah. Because what happened then was that became the narrative that stuck to me. The narrative became, here's a patient with the worst kinds of suicidal and homicidal thoughts, a patient who's been non-compliant, and, has been hiding her thoughts from us. And even though not too long after that false confession, I actually started to recover because my medication had been switched again. And I was then on a different antipsychotic, and I can only imagine that maybe that one had started to work, or it was the passage of time. And I realised within a few days of having made that false confession how serious it was and the seriousness of what I had said. And I tried to retract it. I tried to say, look, I didn't have those thoughts. I never had plans, never had intentions. No, that was the narrative. That was the narrative that stuck to me throughout the rest of my time in hospital. So after, let's say, so it was a week after my re-hospitalisation that I reached this kind of lowest point when I made that confession of thoughts that I'd never had. Then I started to come to my senses, and it took me, say, 2 or 3 or maximum of 4, let's say 3 further weeks to come to the realisation that, well, I had made this very damaging confession. I didn't have the words in my head even to call it a false confession to myself, but I knew that I had said things that, had very serious repercussions for me in terms of how I was perceived by the people treating me. And the second thing that happened over the course of these few weeks as I started to recover, the main thing that happened was I started to realise that the delusional of guilt was a delusion. I started to realise that I hadn't done anything to my children, that my children hadn't been harmed by my medication, and that my children were fine, other than the fact that they had lost their father. So I was coming to the realisation of all of this over, we'll say, 3 weeks.
And do you think that this was because of the medication that you were on? Because you weren't doing talk therapy, it would seem.
I wasn't doing any talk therapy. So all I can say is this happened. It may have been due to the medication. I don't know. It may have been due to the passage of time. It may have been due to the fact, that I was taken out of my environment and given sanctuary, if you like, and given that space. So I don't know which of those things.
Or a combination of
a combination. But I was then in a very, very difficult situation because as a result of making that false confession, I wasn't allowed to see my children. So for a period of 4 weeks, that 4 weeks, I would say, while I was recovering and coming back to my senses, I kept asking, can I see my children? Can I see my children? And I kept being told, the matter of your children now lies with TUSLA, because TUSLA had become involved, the Child and Family Agency. Yeah. And TUSLA had come to visit me in the hospital while I was at the peak of my episode and absolutely terrified me. I was sat down with 2 social workers and told that they were about to conduct a child protection assessment and they would need to visit the children at home and they would need to get information from the school and from the doctors. And I was terrified by this. I wasn't allowed to see my children until TUSLA approved of it. And so there was a gap of 4 weeks from when I was re-hospitalised to when I saw my children. And that, I would say, during those 4 weeks, well, I made the false confession after 1 week. And then we had the further 3 weeks when I came to my senses. So by the time I saw the children, it was excruciating to be separated from them. But I have to say, the one advantage was that when I saw them after the 4 weeks, I looked at them and I do describe it in the book. It's a very kind of moving moment when I saw my children again for the first time. And I just realised there's nothing wrong with them except their hair's too long. Yeah. I never would have let their hair get that long. I never would have dressed them the way they were dressed. Somebody had put them in, sweatpants that I just wouldn't have bought. But there's nothing wrong with them. And I haven't harmed them in any way. And they're nothing other than adorable.
Yeah.
So it had given me that time, excruciating as it was for both them and me, for me to realise that I hadn't harmed them and there was nothing wrong with them. So they started to visit me in the hospital from then on, but they were supervised visits. So there was a social worker also in the room. And after 1 or 2 of these visits, I was pretty much back to my normal way of thinking. So I started to ask, why does a social worker have to be here in the room? Not while the children were there, but I asked. And I was told, it's because of the serious thoughts of harm that you've had when you were re-hospitalised, your thoughts of homicide, your thoughts of suicide that I'd never had and that I knew I'd never had. And I would try and say, well, what thoughts? They saw it as me trying to pretend I'd never had those thoughts. So the other thing that happened as I started to recover, so we're now, as I say, the second hospitalisation was for 10 weeks and we're now 4 to 5 weeks in and I'm coming back to my senses and I'm realising that my delusion of guilt is a delusion. And I'm starting to notice other things. And without going into too much of the gory detail, I started to notice that I was severely constipated. And it's one of the saddest parts of my story, but because of everything that has happened so far, and because of all the mistrust and the misunderstandings, and I would have to say humiliations as well of what I was experiencing, I lacked the confidence and trust to tell the doctors and nurses who were surrounding me every day what was going on with me physically. And I don't want to, it's maybe distasteful for people to hear, but it absolutely blighted my time in hospital. I was afraid that it was going to kill me. I mean, and that wasn't irrational. I literally
go to the toilet.
And I didn't go. And it lasted.
Did they not ask?
Did. Well, you see, this is the shocking thing. Now, this is one of the very shocking things. They did ask me, right? They asked me early on what's going on, because I started to, let's say, leak. I know it's not nice to talk about.
It's actually,
I know.
Unless you're uncomfortable to talk about,
but it's okay. Like, it's not something that you often hear people talking about. But I know
that, and actually, I talk a lot about that in the talks that I do, because it isn't something that's talked about. A lot, not because of this, but a lot of ladies do leak. From the back passage.
And also it's very interesting because it happened at the same time as. I read up a bit, about neuroscience and what happens to the brain, and I just think it's so fascinating that, if I can just digress for a sec, because I just found it so interesting what I read about trauma and the impact that it has on the brain, and how this idea of the three parts of the brain, kind of the frontal cortex and the reptilian part of the brain, and then the emotional part of the brain. And then when you're in a state of psychosis like I was, it's all your emotional part. It's all, like I read Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps a Score, and he calls it the smoke detector. It's the smoke detector part of the brain is just everything, and you're just looking out for danger. And I was so consumed with my thoughts of guilt that the reptilian part of my brain, which is responsible for digestion and sleep and all the automatic parts, had literally switched off. I couldn't eat. I wasn't going to the toilet, but I didn't realise it, because the prefrontal cortex, that watchtower part of the brain, as he calls it, had also switched off. So normally with that bodily process, I think you have physical sensations and signals, but I wasn't picking up on them, hadn't been picking up on them. And also your watchtower, your cortex, your prefrontal cortex will remind you and say, you need to do that once a day. But that hadn't been functioning. And it was as my awareness came back of my delusion of guilt, but also of my body. And at the same time, the reptilian part of my brain kicked back in, and that's when the leaking started. It was only then. So something was going on with me, and I kept dashing to the toilet. And they did ask me, they said, why are you dashing? Just once, why are you dashing? What happened just there? And I just said, nothing. And they said, no, what happened? And I said, well, I'm constipated. How long are you constipated? And I just didn't know. I panicked, and I said 5 days. And they examined me and said, okay, well, you need to improve your fibre intake, you need to improve your water intake. And they never asked me again after that. And it went on the whole time. So for 8 weeks.
Oh my goodness. So uncomfortable.
Yeah, no, just absolutely terrifying. So embarrassing. And I was just at such a low ebb of trust and confidence, and so terrified about what was happening with my children as well, and about this assessment that was going on, that I didn't tell anybody. And it's horrifying. And what I was going to say then, before I digressed, it's in my files. Like, that's the horrific thing. It's in my files that I was smelly.
Okay.
Urine, fetor of urine, stench. They wrote this down over and over, but they didn't investigate. I mean, it's absolutely shocking. So I feel I was treated as less than human. I mean, to note these things down and not investigate them, it's beyond tragic. And it's also beyond tragic that I wasn't able to ask for help with this basic physiological process. And one of the main reasons, apart from me having already made a false confession and, confessed to guilty actions that I had never done in the first place, and now come to the realisation, I was terrified about what was going on with my children, for my children in the outside world. And what I mean by that is this assessment that was going on and being carried out by the Child and Family Agency. So they came in to visit me a couple of times, and they informed me that I wouldn't. Now, there is one element to the story that I have forgotten or just haven't got round to tell you so far, so maybe I should tell you that as well. A week after I was readmitted that time, I left the hospital. I have to add that in. I did leave the hospital, and the reason I left the hospital without permission. And it was just after I had been referred to Tusla and just after I had met the social workers for the first time. And the possibility of foster care had been mentioned to me. And I was so terrified that because of the, at that point, lack of clarity about who was going to mind the children, I became convinced that they were going to be taken away and put into foster care. So I decided to go. Now, I didn't decide. I just drifted out of the hospital. I really wasn't intending to go home to begin with. I was allowed to move around freely in the hospital at that point, and I just kind of saw that the front door was open, and I left. I went out to the road. I saw there was a bus coming, and I jumped on the bus and I went home, and I wanted to check because I was convinced they'd been taken into care already, and they hadn't been. Now, I shouldn't have done that. It was but look, it was a very unwise thing to do. I came back in. So my mother rang. My mother was terrified. Where was I and why had I left? And so I picked up her call then, and I told her that I was on my way home to see the boys. And then, other things kicked in, and actually friends of mine came over then to the house and brought me back in. I didn't go back in kicking and screaming. Yeah. And in fact, I was able to ascertain that they hadn't been taken. But when I left the hospital that time, that set off all sorts of alarm bells, So I'd left the hospital, I'd come back in. That was when I made my false confession then that weekend, because they persisted in asking, what were you intending to do when you left the hospital? Were you intending?
Okay.
Yes. So when the Tusla social workers, coming into the hospital to visit me, they said, if you leave this hospital again, that was said to me by them and also by my consultant, the Mental Health Act will be invoked and you will be detained against your will. Now, I was never going to leave the hospital again. Not after, the severe kind of repercussions that because I was also transferred into a locked ward for a few weeks now. I was transferred. But as I got better, I was never going to leave the hospital again, but I suppose they couldn't be sure of that. And I was also told by the Tusla social workers that I would not have unsupervised access to my children in the community. So I have all this. I have all the files. I have their files. I have, the medical files. So that was the phrase that was used. You won't have unsupervised access to your children in the community. So I was absolutely terrified about what this meant. I just couldn't imagine what it meant. So as I was recovering now, so we're now 5-6 weeks into my second hospitalisation, and I realised what's wrong with my body, and I realised that the delusion of guilt was a delusion, and I realised I've made this awful false confession that has very serious repercussions, like the locked ward and Tusla believing that I had these thoughts towards my children, Tusla coming in and telling me I'm not going to have unsupervised access to my children. And about 4 weeks then before my discharge, so we're up now to kind of late November, and I'm back to my senses, but there's nobody talking to me. There's nobody engaging with me in a meaningful way. None of the medics, the nurses, the doctors, there's no psychotherapist, there's no psychologist trying to disentangle any of this with me. Nobody asking me about the grief. That's one thing that we shouldn't forget. All of this is happening in the context of losing my husband.
I almost actually forgot about the grief.
Yeah, I know. And that's the problem. Everybody forgot about the grief. This is all happening. So we're still only 6 months, 7 months after my husband's very sudden, tragic death. Nobody's ever, I've never asked a single thing about that. Talk to us about the day your husband died. Never once. Never. Nobody's asked me about the grief. Nobody is anymore asking me about the delusion of guilt. So nobody is interacting with me and trying to unravel that. And the false confession, that narrative has stuck to me, you know? So, and that's the narrative now that Tusla's working with as well. So what I was about to say, about 4 weeks then before, so late November, I was told out of the blue, you'll be discharged before Christmas. Happy days, you're going to be discharged. Isn't it wonderful? And I'm kind of looking at them thinking, yeah, but what about my children? I've been told by Tusla I'm not going to have unsupervised access. You're telling me now you're going to discharge me. So where are the children going to be? And I was left without anybody to share any of that with. I was terrified to ask any questions. So terrified that I wasn't telling them about what was going on with me physically. So I spent those last 4 weeks in a state of abject misery. I can only describe it as complete misery. Not knowing what was going to happen with my children, what was going to happen with me, what's going to be the outcome of this physical ailment that I have. How's that ever going to be resolved? And like, it's completely nuts, because I was thinking, if I can just be discharged, maybe I can find a doctor to talk to. I'm in a hospital and I'm too afraid. Because the other reason I was afraid and embarrassed and humiliated was everything I said had an awful habit of coming back to haunt me. Everything I said to one person would get repeated. So it would turn up again at a team meeting. Oh, you said to nurse so-and-so. Or my brother would hear about it. My brother visited from the States, and I said to him, they think I'm a risk to my children. And he said, well, if you talk to them about homicidal and suicidal thoughts, that's what they're going to think. He had been told. My friends had come into me and said, we hear you're being non-compliant with your medication. They had been told that I was non-compliant. So everything I said showed up somewhere else. It was so porous, the whole thing, and I just couldn't.
It's not allowed.
Bear.
They're allowed to. Or I suppose in some way they need to be able to tell the next of kin, but just to tell friends that are visiting, is that?
Well, the friends heard about the so-called non-compliance. One of my friends came over to visit from Germany, one of my best friends, and she came into the hospital the day after she arrived from Germany, and she's very forthright and direct.
Like Germans tend to be.
Yes. She said to me, you're not helping yourself by being non-compliant. And I'm just gobsmacked. She's just come over from Germany. What the word has spread to Germany. So 4 weeks, the last 4 weeks of my hospital stay were an absolute nightmare. Nightmare. Physically, not knowing what's happening with my children. I'm not going to have unsupervised access to them. I've been told Tusla's still conducting an assessment out in the real world. They're visiting the children's school. Like, I'm thinking about that. What's the school hearing about me and my children? GP, my friends. And if
you'd always become paranoid, wouldn't you?
Well, if you weren't already mentally ill, there was so much to be paranoid about it. And then what happened was, it was coming up to, say, a week before when I was supposed to be discharged, and I got a visit from the Tusla social worker, and I was told that a child protection conference would be held before I was discharged, and that Tusla would be recommending that a child protection plan be put in place when I'm discharged from hospital, and that their names would go on an at-risk register and would stay there until they reach the age of 18. So the Tusla social worker read out a report that she was going to present to the Child Protection Conference and asked me to comment on it. Now, it's a 5-page, I have the report, from the files, and it's a 5-page single-spaced report. It was read out to me. I picked up on a few things and asked her to correct them. Nothing was corrected. The same report was read out at the Child Protection Conference then, a few days later. And I don't know what to say about the Child Protection Conference other than it was the most terrifying, frightening, humiliating, invalidating experience of my entire life. And it was decided there that the children's names would go on an at-risk register. I still had no information about what was going to happen when I was discharged, about this idea that I wouldn't have access to my children unsupervised. And after the Child Protection Conference, I was told that I would have overnight leave at home for the weekend and that I should come back for one further night the following week. I went home that weekend, back to my children. I was reunited with my children. I was completely and utterly gobsmacked. I couldn't believe it. I was overjoyed, of course, but I just couldn't believe that I hadn't been told that. I'd been left for 4 weeks in the hospital believing that I wasn't going to have access to my children, and I had never been given an update.
Geez, I'm shocked at that outcome. So they're on an at-risk register, but then you were sent home.
Yeah, now that sounds like an anomaly, but I don't think it is in their book. So what it is they're considered to be at risk of harm. At risk. It doesn't mean that they have been harmed or that they are being harmed.
Yeah.
But there's a risk of harm. And the risk that was argued for at that Child Protection Conference was based on the argument that here was a mother who had suicidal and homicidal thoughts, who couldn't be trusted to take her medication, who it was alleged had disengaged from the day hospital. There was one day that I had missed at the day hospital. And on the basis of all those, what do we call them, arguments, the children were considered to be at risk. Do you understand? So it doesn't mean that they are being harmed. If they were being harmed, then, I don't know much about the whole child protection world, but another mechanism would kick in then. Yeah,
okay.
Then it would go to court, I think.
Okay.
Don't really know. So it's really important, and I've had to do this, to really analyse that language and understand what it means. But to hear repeated over and over again at that Child Protection Conference that I posed a risk to my children was just the most, I don't really have words to describe what that felt like for me,
And especially under the circumstances that no one really would engage with you or talk to you about what had happened.
Kind of the terrible irony as well, because on the one hand, I was never offered so much as a minute's therapy, talk therapy, what I would call proper talk therapy, which I experienced subsequently. I've had to go for lots of therapy subsequently to help me get over the experience in hospital.
I actually was going to say, was it the experience in hospital?
No, it was the experience in hospital. So on the one hand, no talk therapy to talk about the grief, to unravel the delusional belief, to maybe see about that false confession and what, is it a false confession? Is it a real? Nothing there. On the other hand, incessant questioning about, do you have thoughts of harm? Do you intend to harm yourself? Do you intend to harm anybody else? Do you intend to harm your children? What were you planning the day you left the hospital? And everything I said in that context, in a severely disassociated, sort of this derealization, the state that I was in, every single thing I said was taken down and used in evidence against me. And I don't think that's fair. Yeah. So you can't have it both ways. Either I'm not capable of engaging in talk therapy, if that's what you've decided, but why do you keep talking to me about thoughts of harm? And why do you write everything down that I say? And why is it passed on to an outside agency? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah,
it's completely conflictual. If I had simply been left on my bed, highly medicated, and left to rest, and nobody had come near me, it wouldn't have been great, but it wouldn't have had the catastrophic outcome. And for me, it was catastrophic that my children's names went on that register. It's just...
Were they taken off it subsequently?
So they stay on the register until they turn 18. So I've carried that with me now for 10 years, that knowledge.
Jesus.
It hasn't made any material difference to my life. And in fact, but again, I find it ironic, like Tussle's engagement with me came to an end in March 2016. So after a couple of months after I was discharged. So to begin with, there was a child protection plan in place, which really meant visits to the home. Supposed to be weekly, but in reality, every couple of weeks, just until the middle of March. Their involvement with me and my family came to an end then. There's been no subsequent reason for Tussle to be involved with me and my family, but my children's names have remained on that register. And for me, that was a very bitter pill. Now, people might look at my story and say, well, what did you expect with the stuff you came out with? But I just wish that I could have been talked to properly.
Or could they not have seen you like a couple of years afterwards and said she's well?
No. Once it goes on the register, that's it. Okay. And I did actually try and pursue that afterwards in the knowledge that I would probably get nowhere. But I did write them a letter and tell them what happened from my perspective.
And was there ever any investigation done about the way you were treated in hospital and those notes, etc., that you say that you had access to, that you saw that was were awful to read?
Well, they were awful to read for me because I suppose every single thing I said was written down, and I did say some awful things, even if I can explain now where they came from.
Yeah.
It'd be hard to prove that from a medical point of view there was anything amiss in the medical notes as such, although you really do have to question how they were able to write down about my physical ailment and not investigate it. I mean, there was some follow-on afterwards. So I was discharged from hospital then in December 2015, 8 months after John died, almost to the day. And I mean, I just, on the one hand, was overjoyed, relieved. I was back home with my children. I was better. That's the extraordinary thing.
It actually, your recovery was quite quick compared to other psychotic episodes.
Well, I just don't know about other psychotic episodes because I can't really speak for them. But all I can say is I got ill very quickly and I recovered very quickly. I recovered as quickly as I'd got ill. So the whole thing lasted about 4 months, from August to December. But in fact, I was better, you know, in terms of the delusional belief, I was better by late October. So the psychosis, the heart of it lasted for 2 months, from late August to late October. I was discharged from hospital. I was no longer psychotic. I also was no longer depressed. I mean, I was depressed about what had happened to me. I was devastated about what had happened in the hospital. I was no longer depressed in the clinical sense that I had experienced of, you know, extreme fatigue and sadness. I was back to myself, energized. I was able to face my life, face this new life of single motherhood. I went back to work in January. I went back to...
You did not?
I
in
did.
January?
Yeah. So I was discharged final discharge on the 22nd of December. It was the Christmas holidays. My sister was home from New Zealand. We had Christmas together and I went back to work on the 6th of January. The first few weeks of January were non-teaching weeks because we're semesterised. You know, I'm an academic, as I said. But I started back lecturing at the end of January on a full timetable. Better. But devastated, shocked, stunned, traumatised by what had happened to me in the hospital. I mean, by the whole thing, you know, by the whole, like, I kind of describe it as 3 traumas in the book, like the traumatic experience of losing John, the trigger for everything else. The trauma of losing my mind, it's an incredibly terrifying experience to lose your mind and to turn inwards against yourself, because that's what I did. I turned against myself when I was ill. But the trauma of the hospital treatment, and that was the part of the whole thing that I kept silent and that I didn't talk about. So I then... Well, my interaction with Tussle, as I say, happened over a 2-month period. Then from January, February, March, it just involved the occasional home visit, kind of checking in with me, checking how the boys are. And then there was a review case conference in March. And it was decided there that everything's fine and I'm compliant with medication and I'm back at work and the boys are getting grief therapy at school, which they were, and that the child protection plan no longer needs to be in place and the boys' names will remain on the register but inactive. It just means that there's no child protection plan in place. And then goodbye. And that was Tussle. And then, now they did refer me to Bernardo's afterwards, and I have to say they were very helpful, both to me and the children. That was a positive experience.
What do they do? Is it for grief, was it? Or
so there was a child support worker who started working with us over, I think we first saw her in the summer of 2016. And she did some work with me. So I think there was 2 parts to it, that she would work with me as somebody recovering from maybe mental illness, as a mother recovering from mental illness. But I always remember, like, she had worksheets and workbooks, and then she'd come along and start doing it, and then she'd just start chatting to me. We'd just have a chat. She was just so nice and so supportive, and like actually kind of became a friend.
Yeah.
And she just said, look, we don't need to do this. We can chat. She was very nice to me. And then she did some grief work with the boys. And I remember she said to me, if you need any help moving forward, do get in touch. And I did go back to her about my younger son, because it took him longer to come to the realisation that his father, the finality of the death. And I had to go, I sought her out again a couple of years later. Okay. And then she did some very targeted grief work with him. Very helpful. So as I say, Tussle finished their involvement with my family in March 2016. We were referred to Bernardo's, we did that. And then in the meantime, I continued to attend the mental health service as an outpatient. And those appointments happened to begin with quite frequently, maybe once a month, once every 2 months, once every 3 months. And the focus was always, because I was clearly well, and I was well, I felt well.
You weren't asked those bloody awful questions anymore, were you?
I would have been still asked, but not as a big focus. Okay. Because it was clear I would come in there. I mean, I'd be just coming from work or on my way to work or, I was clearly in the fullness of my health and my life. But it was very much focused, especially as time went on reducing my medication. And the other thing I should say before I move on to that, to the outpatient care, my physical ailment, it's so interesting, started to right itself without the need for intervention.
Once you left the hospital?
It's incredible.
Yeah.
So I talked to a therapist, like eventually I went to a trauma therapist about that whole hospital experience. She just found that aspect so interesting. She said that's very Freudian, Marianne. Holding back in that area and then letting go. It's just very interesting. Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's the full story. And I said that to her. I said, I think really that it was to do with this reptilian brain and the way my digestion, everything had just slowed down. And the medication, of course, has that impact. But the fact is that gradually, and it took a few months for it to right itself, to go back to the way it used to be. But it happened itself. And I just think that's so fascinating. But I was still really worried about it. It had been such a traumatic aspect of the whole experience. I went to a gastroenterologist and I had some tests. And I told him what had happened. And he kind of looked at me and he said, 8 weeks or 10 weeks? Oh, I've heard of 6 weeks or 7 weeks, but 10 weeks? Oh, all I can say is it happened.
They didn't need to physically remove anything?
Okay. Because it righted itself.
Yeah, okay.
But it's incredible. But I needed to just get that reassurance because, like, I didn't know, is this going to come back? Or I was still really on edge about it. So I was better. Like, I was physically better. I was mentally better. I was still engaging with the mental health service. I was still taking an awful lot of medication. Gradually, they started to reduce the antipsychotic medications over the course of the first year post-discharge, so throughout 2016, because they said my prolactin levels were very elevated, and that was why I wasn't having my periods anymore. They never asked me that in the hospital. I mean, it might have helped me to engage with my body if I might have... See, that's the other thing, kept in the dark about everything. But anyway... Antipsychotic medication gradually reduced over the course of a year. I didn't suffer any adverse reactions, thank God, because I've read that people do and can.
You're probably weaned down very slowly.
Very carefully. Brilliant. And very gradually. At least that aspect of my medication experience was a good one, because obviously going on it initially was a horrifying one, and then what happened to me in hospital. But gradually that was reduced.
But that's the antipsychotic you're talking about.
Antipsychotic.
So you're still currently at that time then on the antidepressant.
So by the time I left hospital, I was on 2 antipsychotics. So both the antipsychotic that I had been originally on, and that was replaced by a different one, was eventually reintroduced. So I was on 2 antipsychotics and 2 antidepressants by the time I left hospital. Over the course of 2016, the antipsychotic was gradually tapered off. And then over the course of 2017, the 2 antidepressants. Now, one of them, again, has to be reduced very, very slowly. It's a slow, I can't remember which switch, slow-acting drug. So it just needs to be very, very slowly tapered down. And...
Do you know what? Can we just say, because that's so important that people understand that, because I would have a lot of people in the pharmacy wanting to come off their medication quickly, because... the stigma around being on mental health medication. Yeah. It's just so very important that you do it in accordance with your doctor, the pharmacist, reducing down so very gradually.
Yeah, totally.
So important, because it can actually cause rebound anxiety. It can actually cause mental health issues that were never there in the first place.
And it can cause rebound psychosis as well, the antipsychotic. Yeah. So I'm very grateful for that aspect of my experience, that it was managed really, really carefully by my outpatient consultants. And it did take 2 years. I mean, when you think it was all tapered up, I mean, I was put on all these drugs really, really quickly, but it took 2 years to come off them all. Now, there was a point in the middle of all of that when it was said to me that I should stay on an antidepressant long term. I myself didn't believe that I needed to, and I was asked, would I cooperate with them coming off? I said, of course I will. I'll do everything you tell me, but it is my ambition to come off the medication fully. And they did. One of the doctors did want me to stay on, but for lots of reasons. I really noticed while I was still on the medication that I still wasn't crying. I still couldn't cry. I stopped crying in August of 2015 when that reaction happened to me, that physical reaction. And when I became psychotic, I was no longer able to cry at all.
Kind of like a numbness.
I don't know. Yeah. A numbness. And then even afterwards, while I was still taking a lot of medication, you know, while I was well and discharged, but like nothing could make me cry. I couldn't really, even when we went and buried John's ashes, like, which is incredibly tragic kind of event, just me and the 2 boys. And still I just felt kind of numb. I wanted to come off, but I was prepared to do whatever they told me in terms of coming off gradually, of course. And I also wanted to come off eventually because I didn't want them to have any more power over me. I wanted to be off. I wanted to be finished eventually, no matter how long it took. Because one of the things I had been told, this is what happened, the very last thing the Tussa social worker said to me in March 2016, she said to me, if you ever become non-compliant with your medication again, you'll be referred back to Tussa.
So that fear that is instilled in you as a mother, you know?
I felt for that reason, I'd say that had a lot to do with it. But just in general, I felt I want to come off the medication eventually, safely, slowly, whatever it takes.
Yeah.
And I did successfully come off that medication over a period of 2 years. And that was very important to me.
Yeah.
And it was only then that I started to ask questions. So we're talking now early 2018.
Yeah.
So 2 years after I was discharged from hospital, I began to get very angry. I was very angry. That's what I started to feel. So I'm no longer taking medication. Yeah, I feel grief. I feel sadness. Not debilitating grief, but sadness. But I felt anger. I felt a lot of anger about what had happened to me in the hospital. And my outpatient appointments at this time were only happening there was only like every 5 months, every 6 months, just to check. So I only had really 2 scheduled appointments in 2018. And the first one of those, I had come off my medication completely under the supervision of the consultant. And without intending to, I went in for that consultation and I started to talk to him about what had happened to me in hospital. I started to say some of the stuff. I told him about the constipation for the first time. I told him what the Child Protection Conference had felt like for me and the terror of being assessed by TUSLA while I was in hospital and believing that my children were not going to be reunited with me. And he was very nice. He was, he hadn't been involved in my care directly in hospital and I felt more relaxed with him. And he said a few things to me. And one of the things he said to me was, you might like to write us a letter about what happened to you. And I went home and I thought about that. I thought about a letter. That never occurred to me. And I thought, a letter? Why don't I write a letter? So I did.
Almost like it gave you a little nudge to...
So I did. I wrote a 5-page letter to the hospital, to him, to that consultant who was part of the team, even though he hadn't directly treated me in hospital. And I suppose you could say that letter was a mini version of my book. It was the first time that I put it all in writing. And I provided a chronological account of what had happened to me from my perspective. And I finished that letter with a series of questions relating to my care. So I asked, why was the story of non-compliance put out there when there had been a tiny bit of non-compliance? And I mentioned that, when it was such a minimal issue, why was it put out there? Why did nobody talk to me when I was in hospital, when I was languishing in hospital? Why did nobody talk to me about what psychosis is and about what was happening with TUSLA? I asked, why are vulnerable patients expected to open up at team meetings with, multiple professionals present in the room? So I sent off that letter and I also thanked the medical staff in the letter. I was careful to do that. I mean, I am grateful that I survived and that I was given that sanctuary, terrible as it was, and I did acknowledge that and say thank you. And on foot of that letter, I was invited in to meet that particular consultant, my outpatient consultant, with the social worker who had been involved at the time, the hospital social worker who had been part of the team, who would be at team meetings, who was kind of liaising between the hospital and TUSLA as well. And I was invited in to meet them and to discuss my letter. And I decided in advance of that meeting that I was going to bring a friend with me.
I knew you were going to say that.
Did you?
I did.
And the reason I did that, because
clever.
Well, I'm an academic and I know there are some, when I say I'm an academic, what I mean is I work in academia. There are so many processes at work to protect students. so many appeals processes, so many different ways that students are protected, including if there's a difficult meeting, they can bring a friend. Would you like to bring a friend? We always say to them. Well, I thought to myself, okay, I'd like to bring a friend. And I did. I said to the consultant in advance, I said, I'd like to bring a friend. Of course, you can bring a friend. So I did bring a friend. An old friend of mine, I gave her the letter to read in advance, which was a hard thing to do because it was the first time I was sharing with her or anybody. Nobody knew. None of my friends knew any of this. They didn't know what had happened to me physically in the hospital. They didn't know about my false confession. They might have known a tiny bit about Tusla, although it took me an awful long time to say that to anyone. It was all bottled up inside me. Nobody knew about it. And we went in and we had that meeting. And it was kind of helpful, just kind of.
Okay.
In the sense that I suppose I was able to give my side of the story. But, I mean, the trauma had happened. And the Tusla thing had happened. And we spent some time talking about Tusla. And I was kind of sorry afterwards that we did because, I mean, they're not responsible for Tusla. I should have made them talk about the absence of talk therapy in the hospital. About those questions. But anyway, it helped a bit. It helped a bit. But the interesting thing was it made me realise how beneficial writing was to me.
Okay.
That was the start of it.
Okay.
Yeah. And the consultant did say that there's a lot of learning in there for them. And that was good to hear.
Okay, well that is very positive,
that
isn't
was
it?
really good. And that's what started the whole writing process. Really. And at that time, I was particularly perturbed and thinking an awful lot about what had happened to Tusla in particular. You know, the way the whole narrative had become that, you know, I was a risk to my children, which was deeply, deeply upsetting to me. And I was really curious to understand that aspect of the story. So I discussed with the two medics as well that day. I said to them, I'm going to get my files from Tusla because I want to understand this and I want to see if I can appeal it. Because that's the thing at work. Students can appeal everything. Appeal every exam mark, every essay mark can be appealed. So I thought, well, maybe that can be appealed. But it couldn't be.
Okay.
Couldn't be. But I got my files from Tusla. And that's what prompted me to start writing really then. It was in response to those files, to the Tusla files. And that was at a time, so we're still in 2018. I had one final consultation with the mental health service. Then my case was closed. You know, I was no longer on medication. I was no longer in need of any psychiatric input. And I started to examine my Tusla files. I started to write up my own story because I looked at those records and I thought, they might be your records. That's not my record. That's not my story. That might be your story of what happened to me. This is my story. So I started to write my story. And as I wrote my story, I realised I'm going to need my medical files as well. I can't get the full picture. The full picture isn't in the Tusla files.
Yeah.
And anyway, this is really a medical story. You know, it's a story of mental ill health and mental treatment. And the Tusla story is part of that, but it comes under it. So then I went and got my medical files. Now, they were very, very voluminous, which is the word they used. 8 volumes, going from the moment I was referred to the mental health service in August 2015 to my final outpatient appointment in September 2018.
And do you receive them in paper form or okay?
Paper.
Was that not very upsetting to reread them?
Yeah, but I was so stuck into the writing. I finally got those medical files, all of them, in September 2019. So I was already a year into writing.
Was there resistance to giving them to you?
Yes.
Okay, so how did you get them then?
I had to make a complaint to the Office of the Information Commission.
Okay.
And within a week of that complaint, I had the rest of my files. So there was 8 volumes and they were being drip fed to me. A volume here, a volume there. But the volumes dealing with the central part of the story were not being, let's say they just weren't.
And was there anything redacted from those?
Yeah. Yes, of course it was.
Okay.
So it took me 9 months to get my files.
Were you able to insist on the redacted stuff being re-put in, or was that just...
I had one question that I went back to them about.
Okay.
It was kind of interesting. I won't go into it now, but I never got a response to that. So I just left it. No, I had enough information. I had enough for what I wanted. And it was really, really interesting then, because I had 2 sets of files, and it's just fascinating sometimes to compare. So there's one event. I've got my memories, which are very, very clear memories, because I'd gone back over everything so much in my mind from when I had been recovering in hospital. That's what I used to do, just spend my days lying on my bed, unravelling the whole thing, trying to figuring it all out. I had kept that story in my mind for 3 years, going over and over and over and over it again, crystal clear in my mind. So I'd have my memories of what had happened, very clear memories. That's what's interesting as well. I go through psychosis, still very, very clear memories. And I knew what was real and what wasn't real.
I was going to ask you that, because has anyone said to you, well, how do you know what you were experiencing was real, or what you remember was real? Yeah.
So just to finish what I was going to say then, and I will come back to that question, and then I have my medical file and I have my tussle file, all about the same event and very different. It's just very interesting questions of truth and reality.
To see how the medical file talks to the tussle file and how they interpret what the medical file
They weren't talking to each other, but they were writing up the same event or the same, and then something might have been redacted in one file but not the other. It's fascinating. But to come back to your other question about how did I know what was real and what wasn't real,
or has it ever been suggested to you, well, look, you know, you're in a state of psychosis, you've admitted that, how do you know what you were experiencing was real?
I haven't been asked that question, and I think the reason is, like, I've been told that my book, and I know I'm just specifically in relation to my book, is written in such an authoritative way that you don't question it.
Yeah, well, I don't question what you're saying either, but
I know myself. Now, it's all 10 years ago. If I was to sit down now and start trying to write what happened to me 10 years ago, I wouldn't be able to do it with the same level of accuracy. But you have to remember that I was writing this, and I was writing it in my head almost, or I was regurgitating, revisiting it the whole time, from when I started to recover in hospital, right through the following years, right through until I started to write. It was all so clear. But what's really interesting, I'm not sure if it's quite your question, but what I wanted to say a minute ago, when I was recovering in hospital, and by the time I was recovered, I was completely able to distinguish in my mind between what had been real and what wasn't real. So I knew that none of the medication stuff hadn't happened. I'd never medicated my children like that. That was completely clear to me. Nothing had happened to my children. And there were other things, like I had been kind of paranoid. Like when I started to get ill, it started with paranoia. You know, I was suspicious of people, suspicious of the school principal. She rang to see how we were getting on, and I thought she got some interest in the children. That was paranoia, and I was able very clearly to see that. Or as I was recovering on the ward, just after the peak of my episode, and I was kind of paranoid about the other people on the ward, that I was thinking they have mobile phones and I don't, but they didn't have mobile phones. But there was a reason why I thought that. But afterwards, I knew very, very clearly what had really happened and what hadn't happened. And I was also able to remember it all really well. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to everybody who becomes mentally ill. I know that. And maybe it depends on the illness. Maybe it, I just can't say. But in my case, very, very clear recollection of everything that had happened. But partly, I think, because I was left on my own, there was nobody talking to me in any real sense, for 4, 5, 6 weeks, when I had come back to my senses. And all I did was go back over and over and over and over and start unravelling it myself. So
isn't the mind an amazing
It's
thing?
Amazing. And like when I went in to have that conversation after I'd written my letter, even then in 2018, and I brought my friend in with me, and they were going through my letter, kind of on sort of the chronology, and cross-checking it with the files that they had that I didn't have at that point. But sure, everything I'd said in the letter was completely spot on. They were just checking, was that then? And yeah, of course it was. I knew exactly. Okay. I knew everything. I think probably we need to have a lot more respect for the brain, and even what we call an ill brain.
Well, this is it. Like you experienced a psychotic break, but you recovered wholly from it.
Yeah,
and I've always been so interested in mental illness in many shapes and forms, because of my line of work. But yeah, what a fascinating story.
But the other thing I think is fascinating, I really do, and I had to research it and come to an understanding of it myself through writing. That delusional belief I had, it had meaning. It made sense in an irrational way. It came from somewhere. That conviction that my children had been harmed by my medication, that came from somewhere. It came from the trauma of telling them that their father had died, where I felt guilty that I was doing that. It came from the worries that I had. I had a lot of worries even for their mental health, ironically. For their mental health, for their social skills. I was afraid, they've lost their father, they're going to, you read about that's a risk factor. If you lose a parent in childhood, and I would have been aware of that. You lose your parent in childhood, and it's a risk factor for later on developing mental illness. Of course, if you have a good parent, like they did have, that lessens that risk. But at the time, I worried about their mental health. I worried about their social interaction, making friends. That was the worry. And then when I had the physical reaction to the medication myself, and I wasn't able to function properly, I wasn't able to think properly, I was the one who was suffering from all these things that I said that my children were, that I believed my children were suffering. It was me who was suffering them. I was trying to convey that. I was looking for help. And I got help. That's the other really interesting thing, that a delusional thought, like my delusional thought, it actually meant that I was hospitalised. And I needed to be hospitalised. And regardless of everything that went wrong, I got better. I recovered. I was given the time. I was taken away from this terrible burden of responsibility. And I just think that's so fascinating, that my brain...
Yeah.
In a way, you could see, how ingenious is that? My brain came up with this terribly distressing, to me, was terribly distressing conviction that was so alarming to everybody else that they ended up helping me. I just think it's fascinating.
No, I do too. Has it got you into look at, well, you've already said it, but about neuroplasticity and all of that?
So one of the things I did as well, I mean, you might wonder where I get the energy or the time, but I went off and did a degree in psychology.
Of course you did,
yeah. As you do.
When are you doing the Masters though?
No, I'm enrolled in the Masters. Well, I thought I'm reading all this stuff. I might as well. So I enrolled with the Open University, but like you can see, like, I mean, just me as an example, I mean, how ill I was and impaired and broken mentally and physically and back to full health and more.
I know.
And more. It gave me incredible strength as well. Especially to reach an understanding of everything that had happened, just that insight. But the fact, that I was so let down by services, I have to say that, I was terribly let down. But,
one doesn't... You can say you were looked after in a way and you got better, yes, and you can say that. But it's still equally important to say you were also let down.
I was let down as a human being. Yeah. I wasn't just a collection of symptoms. My symptoms did resolve while I was in hospital. So in that sense, you could say I'm a success story. But as a human being, I just felt annihilated. But I did feel, by the time I was discharged from that hospital, I felt that my identity had been torn to shreds. Okay?
Yeah.
So my identity as a mother, I mean, to hear repeated over and over and over that I was considered to pose a risk to my children. I mean, how annihilating that was. Also to have it repeated. That case conference, there was 8 professionals at it and me. My identity as a mother, my identity as a daughter to my 90-year-old mother who had to support me through this and did a heroic job, but still, my friends, my identity as a friend, as somebody who could be trusted, they lost their trust in me when they were told that story about medication, My identity, I would say, as a professional as well, who, works using their brain, and my consultant herself actually used the term basket case. So I have a chapter, now there's context for this, I have a chapter in my book called Basket Case, because she said, as we were leaving the case conference and we met another psychiatrist who was always very kind to me, I have to say. I say that a few times in the book. And he asked, how did it go? And my consultant was so annoyed about what had happened at the case. She said they treated her like a basket case. So I was treated like, in the words of my consultant, a basket case. So my identity was torn to shreds. So yes, I recovered and my symptoms resolved. But in the process, that's what happened to me. But what I wanted to say a moment ago is I found the strength inside myself to pick myself up on my own and to recover from that. And that has given me so much strength.
And that's testament to your strength. But I do wonder and worry about people that may not have that inner strength. What happens to them?
I have a paragraph in the book and I say exactly that I often wonder about people to whom life may have been less kind. Because I could draw, prior to that happening to me, I was able to draw on 5 decades of reasonable, the love of my family, various successes, I suppose, if we think those things are important, but still, becoming a mother to 2 boys and having a man in my life for 15 years. And it's one of the, people have told me they've cried over this part of the book, but where I say, who woke every morning with a smile on his face and told me that he loved me. Okay? So I was able to draw on that. And I say, I often wonder what the effect of my hospital experience would have been on somebody with a lesser sense of self, or a less fortunate circumstances to draw on. So I'm so aware of that. And I do feel, I hope that one of the things with this book that I can speak for other people who just may not be able to find the voice that I've been able to find.
People reached out to you to say that this experience something similar? Yeah,
people have written to me, people have sent me emails, people have thanked me. And not saying it doesn't happen all the time, but every day or two I'm getting an email from somebody I don't know, or sometimes people I do know, and thanking me or saying something similar has happened to them. I mean, how many people can go through what I went through and A, find the strength, and B, have a kind of the academic educational background that I have that has enabled me to research this stuff and write about it in a way that's clear and accessible, because that's what I've been told that it is, that I have managed to write about very difficult subject matter in a very clear and accessible way, not in an academic style.
That's all you want to do, isn't it?
Yeah, but how many people can do that? So when I was writing this, and to begin with, I was writing it for myself, but as time went on, I thought, I have to share this. I have to do this for other people as well. I have to share my insights both about my own breakdown, but about the treatment I received. I have to do this. I have to publish it if I can, and I have to do that on behalf of other people as well.
Yeah. My goodness.
But
it's in all good bookstores.
Yeah.
Is there an audio book as well?
Yeah, and I recorded that.
Oh, did you?
I did.
How long did that take you?
It took me 2.5 days.
Oh, right. Okay. You just went for it. So, did you? Yeah. Did you lock yourself up in a room and just go boom?
With a sound engineer.
Okay.
So I had to go to a sound studio.
Okay.
Over 2.5 days. It was a fascinating experience. It was a brilliant experience. That was hard, very emotional, very intense. It happened about 4 weeks before the publication, so it made me very, very familiar with the whole text again, had that advantage. But I did break down in a few places, but the sound engineer said that's fine as long as it's comprehensible. And if it isn't comprehensible, we would have just re-recorded those bits, but it gives that authenticity. I didn't exactly break down, but you could hear the emotion. And sometimes in places where I wouldn't have been expecting it as well.
Yeah.
So, in the aftermath as well, when I even that section, where I talk about, the good things that I'd had in my life before then, and then my voice kind of breaks a bit, or when I was finally discharged from hospital. But I did that recording myself, yeah. And it was a great experience.
I love audiobooks, I have to say, because you can just listen to them whenever,
Yeah.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
What a story.
Yeah. Yeah,
Thank you for giving me your time.
So yeah, you're very welcome.
Can I ask you one thing?
Yeah.
Why German?
Just one of those things. When I was in school, I loved languages.
Yeah.
In particular, I loved German and Irish. Didn't really like the French that much. And so when I went to college, I did German. And I was 2 years into college when I went away to Germany for a year. You know, I took a year out. Actually took a year out in those days. And I loved it so much over there that I didn't come back.
Really?
Yeah. And I ended up doing my degree over in Germany.
Okay.
So I lived over there for 6 years. So I got really, really fluent German. I loved it over there. Still love Germany and Germans. Some of my best friends are German. And I came back to Ireland in the 90s. There was quite an interest in Germany and German after reunification, and I got a job teaching German. I didn't know I was going to end up teaching German, but I did. And I've stayed in that area all my life.
Okay.
And I love Germany and the German language, obviously. Yeah.
Great. No, I just wanted to know.
Yeah.
And what advice would you give young people today?
Well, I mean, that's a really big question.
It is.
I suppose, probably the advice that I might have liked to have had myself when I was younger, which is a hard thing for any young person to do, but to believe in yourself and not to care too much about what other people think about you. But it's hard when you're young. But just to believe in yourself and to follow your own instincts. And I don't know if I can say too much more than that. But I would have wished that for my younger self.
Yeah.
Just to be more grounded and have that self-belief and follow your own instincts and your own dreams.
And what is the meaning of life?
Well, the meaning of life has to be human relationships, love, friendship, care, compassion, understanding. That's all that matters in the end on your gravestone. It's going to be you were a mother, a father, a daughter, a sister, much loved. Those are the things that matter.
This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Thank you so very much for your time. So episode is out now. It's obviously available in audiobook as well.
Yeah.
In all good bookstores, online I'm sure too.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, you're very welcome.